Hello, my name's Annie, and I'm a therapist with Counselling4Yeovil. And we're looking at anxiety. We've looked at an introduction to anxiety, looking at the reasons why we might be anxious, trying to understand ourselves and our anxiety. And now we're looking at things which can help us, and we've looked at the first two. So in the last video, we looked at P for permit and E for engage, and we're spelling out the word peaceful. So we're trying to go from anxious to peaceful. If you haven't looked at the first video, now might be a good time to do that. It might make more sense, but this one stands alone as well. So today we're dealing with A and C, and A is going to be for activate and C for change. But also we're talking about the two parts of the brain that are involved in anxiety, and they are called the amygdala and the cortex. So they also start with A and C, which is useful. So we're going to start with activate and amygdala. And the amygdala we've talked about before. It's the prehistoric instinctive part of our brain. Animals have the same process that goes on, and cavemen had the same process go on in their brain. The amygdala is like the smoke alarm. It keeps us safe. It signals danger. And what it does is bypass the rational thought processes completely. So when you have anxiety, which is amygdala based, it's no good trying to reason with it. You can talk to it and persuade it that it's completely unnecessary to be afraid. It won't make any difference. This kind of anxiety bypasses your rational brain. And what happens is the amygdala senses danger. It immediately chooses a response for you: fight, flight, or freeze. And it sends all the adrenaline coursing around your body, ready to fight or run away or freeze. Sometimes we do as well. And that's when we get all the symptoms, because it's sent all the blood rushing to our extremities so we can run fast or fight well. And if we're not going to end up running and fighting, we still can have all that uncomfortable symptom, all those uncomfortable symptoms. So we might sweat, we might feel sick, we might feel as if we need to go to the toilet, we might really feel our heart is racing very fast, all the things which we would need if we were going to fight or run away. To be the most effective we can be. So this is what the amygdala does, and it's like a smoke alarm. But when we suffer from anxiety, often it's like a faulty smoke alarm. When our children were younger, we had a smoke alarm just outside the kitchen, and it used to go off pretty much every time I cooked tea. So much so that when we visited someone else's house and the children saw their smoke alarm, they jumped up and down with excitement and said, "We've got one of those for our tea time." So to them, it was almost like a dinner bell because it went off so often. And of course, you don't take much notice when the smoke alarm goes off too often. It's faulty. It's not doing its job properly. And the amygdala can be a little bit like a faulty smoke alarm. It goes off so often that you feel anxious at times when actually you don't need to be anxious. And there are lots of reasons why that might happen. It might be because it's just one of those situations that the amygdala is particularly prone to view as dangerous. So that you'd be aware that some things are quite common things for a lot of people to be afraid of. We don't exactly know why, but insects is a very common one. A lot of people are afraid of insects, even though the insect wouldn't hurt them. And it could also be that you had an experience. It may not be in your conscious mind. You might have been very young. You had an experience that was unpleasant, like a dog frightening you when you were 2 years old. You may not consciously remember it, but your amygdala remembers. And so it's made a connection. Dog equals fear or danger or pain if the dog bit you. So even though you don't remember what happened, you know that you feel very uneasy when you're around dogs and they cause you anxiety, and possibly you don't go outside in case you come across a dog. It can be quite extreme the way anxiety affects us. And fear of going outside is a big fear, and one that holds people back a lot. Fear of enclosed spaces, lifts, fear of airplanes, lots of things. Most of us suffer from anxiety in some way or other. And because you can't reason with this kind of anxiety, the best way to deal with it is to have a new experience of that thing which you're afraid of. So the best way to retrain your amygdala is to have the experience again, but it to be a pleasant experience, one that doesn't frighten you, a safe experience. So if you have fallen off a bike, the old adage is that you have to get straight on and ride it again, and then you have the confidence to do it. And that if you don't get back on, then you're more likely to be scared to do it next time. There's a reason for that, a very good reason for that. It's about this um, retraining your brain. If you avoid something, it reinforces that message to your amygdala that this is dangerous. Um, and the way to change that is by doing that thing and it being a safe experience. So because you can't reason with it, you have to experience something different. And that's why this stands for A, because you're activating the neurons in your brain in a different way. Brains are amazing, and you can retrain your brain. Um, I'm sure it's easier when you're younger, but you can do it at any stage. You can retrain your brain to connect the neurons, kind of fire and make connections in a different way, so that the ones that might have gone dog equals danger equals anxiety can go dog equals happy, friendly experience equals no anxiety. By having a different experience, you might need to persevere with this. You might need to have a different experience several times until your brain starts to get it and think, actually, this is okay. You might need support at the start when you are having this new experience, in order to be able to do it, because it's really hard to do something you're terrified of. But as soon as you can, you need to put the support down as well and do it on your own, because even that is going to tell your brain that, oh, this is dangerous. I'll probably be just about okay if I have this in place and that in place and the other in place. So as soon as you can, you're going to try and do the thing and have an okay experience of it. Sometimes it can help to watch somebody else doing it and see that they are okay. So if, like me, you're terrified of things with long dangly legs, yes, I know, I need therapy. Actually, one day, Daddy Longlegs flew into the house like that, and a friend who was there, who wasn't afraid of them, just kind of went, oh, and caught it like this and put it back outside again. And for a brief period, I wasn't as scared of them. If I'd persevered with that and actually carried on catching them myself and putting them out, I might have got over that fear. But instead, I was lazy about it, and there are people in my house that will catch Daddy Longlegs for me. So I scream and they come running and they deal with them. I will need to have a go at that sometime myself, but it does work in other areas, like getting on airplanes. Another thing I've not been at all happy about. To do it and to have an okay experience of it is the best way to be able to do it and to get over the anxiety. The other part of your brain that also is used in anxiety is your cortex. So this is the rational thinking part of the brain. And what generally happens is we think a thought, it stimulates an emotional circuit in our brain, which gets the adrenaline going, and that creates a physiological response in our body. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is Jill Bolt Taylor, a neuroanatomist, who says this and has some good evidence for it. The physiological lifespan of an emotion in the body and the brain is only around 90 seconds. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? The reason our emotions last longer is because we're reinforcing them. Sometimes it will be a dangerous situation that will reinforce it. A lot of the time, it's our negative thinking or are dwelling on it or are worrying about it that reinforces it. So if we can manage not to do that, then the actual emotion doesn't last very long. If we can think, okay, a thought is just a thought. An emotion is just an emotion. A mood is just a mood. I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm not going to analyze it and try and solve it. I'll just let it sit there and it will go. Moods and feelings, they do change. So a lot of the time we prolong it by our attitude towards it. What you have in life generally is you have an event, you have then the meaning which you personally give that event, and then you have the emotion that follows on from that. So the thing that makes the difference to the emotion is what meaning you give the event. So that's why two people can have the same thing happen to them, and one of them can be in pieces about it and absolutely frantic, and another one can be coping quite calmly, because we give the event a certain meaning, and that makes all the difference to how we feel about it. So it's half the situation that we're in, which may not be very pleasant, but it's half the attitude that we take towards it, which we can do something about. And this is where practice comes in, good old-fashioned practice. What you're trying to do is change habits of thinking, and changing any habit is very difficult because it's partly not in your consciousness. You don't always realize you're doing it. And so to change the habit, you have to first realize that you're doing it. If you have a habit of thinking quite negatively about things, you might need some prompts, like maybe some smiley face stickers on the bathroom mirror in the morning or somewhere, or the kitchen cupboard. And just to remind you, if my mind is going in a very negative way, how could I change this habit and choose to see things more positively? Now, that might be people, there might be a person that you're convinced has it in for you, that might be a situation that you're convinced you won't cope with, it might be a thought that you've had that is very negative. You could stop and you could think, how could I view this more positively? We're not talking being delusional here. Difficult things happen and we get anxious about them, or we care about them, and that's totally appropriate. But although we often think being too positive about things could be delusional and being in la la land, often being too negative about things is just as delusional, because we don't, that's not the truth. That's very often far from the truth. Oh, I just know that this is going to go wrong. No, we don't. It's not the truth. But we buy into the negative stuff much more easily than the positive stuff. So what we're doing here is we're trying to find the truth in a situation, and we're trying to practice different habits of thinking. So C is for change your thinking. It's also for cortex, which is a bit of the brain involved in it, but it's for change your thinking. And to change habits, we need first to notice them, and then we need to practice. Anyone who used to bite their nails and tried to stop, they may have had that horrible tasting stuff painted on their nails to remind them every time they go to bite their nails that they mustn't do it. But it's hard to change habits, so we need to be patient with ourselves and we need to practice. And there are a few very common habits of negative thinking which can make us much more anxious. And I'll run through them quickly, but they'll be on the screen, and then you can pause the screen and write them down if you want to. So there's only noticing the bad stuff. When I first started secondary school teaching, they gave me some really difficult classes. They always seem to give new teachers very difficult classes. And I wasn't experienced, so I didn't know what to do. So I would come home and I would say, oh, it was awful. Though a fight broke out in the classroom and someone tried to set fire to the desk with their cigarette lighter. And it was an interesting school where I did my first teaching. And then my husband would say, what about the other classes? Because I had 6 classes a day to teach. Very often the other 5 would have gone really well. But when he asked how my day was, I would launch in on the bad stuff. So only noticing the bad stuff. Because then you draw a conclusion, oh, I must be useless at teaching because all that happens. Actually, 5 out of 6 lessons going well for a new teacher is pretty good. So I could draw a different conclusion. making a judgment rather than just describing something. So instead of just noticing and describing what actually happens, we make a judgment about what that might mean or what that person might feel or might have thought. Predicting what will happen when we don't know. We often predict, oh, it's going to be awful. I know it's going to be terrible, this meeting, and I'm not going to cope, and they're going to ask me this, and or an interview or whatever. We often predict what will happen. We don't know that it's going to be bad, so why assume and make ourselves more anxious? I feel bad, so it must be bad. Us feeling people are very good at this. Our feelings take up a lot of space in us. So if we feel bad about something, we can easily assume it must be bad, but they're just feelings. I know what you're thinking about this. It's probably more about my own thoughts. So I've done something, I know you're going to be really cross about it. You might not be. It might be that I would be really cross if it was done to me. It's often about our own thoughts, exaggerating the risks of the negative, um, comparing ourselves unfavorably with other people. How many of us do that? We assume pretty much everybody else we know would be much better at something than we are. Catastrophizing. The worst possible thing that could happen will happen. Yeah. A kind of internal bullying and criticism and putting ourselves down. All these things contribute so much to living in an anxious way and feeling anxious about life. Black and white thinking. It's either going to be terrible or it's going to be brilliant. We can't cope with it being somewhere in between. Lots of I should, I ought, I must type thinking puts a lot of pressure on us. There's a kind of expectation that we've somehow failed if we haven't done something. If we could change that to perhaps I could, or I'd like to if possible, that would take some pressure off. And then a really horrible feeling that everything is too much for us. Can also be based on bad things from the past. It can be based on a memory of bad things happening in the past that were too much for us, and being able to say, okay, that feeling belongs back then, but that was then, and this is now. In this current situation, it's not going to be bad like it was back then. So the feeling comes from back then, being able to label it. You need to be really kind to yourself if you've had those kind of experiences when you were younger and they've left you feeling that life is too much and that you can't cope and that bad things are going to happen. Be very gentle and kind with yourself. Maybe go and get some extra help from a counsellor or a friend or a pastor. But that feeling probably belongs back then rather than now. And if you can help yourself to see that, that will help you. So replacing your thoughts with coping thoughts is a really good way to reduce your anxiety too. Distracting yourself, humour, planning how to do something rather than worrying about how to do something. Also the usual things, exercise, mindfulness. We'll come back to more about that later. But often a positive or a more positive view of your situation is just as likely to be true, and you've got just as much evidence for it as the negative one that you might be in the habit of holding. So change your thinking, and I hope that these two hints will really make a difference to your anxiety.